First time talking to you, Peter. I just think this whole research, from what I've seen from the outspec, I know you're going to tell us in detail. I think it's fascinating. Maybe we can talk about the collaboration with Preston Nichols and the backdrop of the Philadelphia experiment, and just give us a synopsis for those people that want to know about the Montauk project.
Okay, a very quick synopsis is that, and I learned so much of this from Preston Nichols, and is that the Philadelphia experiment was a experiment in 1943, which was the culmination of many years of research when the Navy was trying to make a destroyer escort appear invisible to radar because of all the Nazi ships that were sinking American ships, merchant ships. And this experimentation involved the degaussing or the demagnetizing rather, of the ship. And this was coincident with the ship disappearing and it actually moving back into time or forward into time. We don't know I don't know the exact dates it moved to. This experiments caused a great deal of trauma to the crew. The research was done primarily at Camp Upton, which is now Brookhaven National Laboratories. And this was figuring out the mind of man and what made it tick and how come when it went into time displacement, it became distorted. Humans became distorted, their bodies, their minds, their spirits. So this research carried on at Montauk eventually, at first at Brookhaven, and then it went to Montauk where they were successfully connecting up people to the radio frequency, and they would amplify the radio frequency, and where thoughts could come out on a computer or they could come out into the ether, so to speak. And this is what the Montauk Project was, in a nutshell, in a very brief nutshell. I mean, of course, Hillary's very familiar with it from having read the book and talked to various people, including myself.
Peter, maybe the thing that I realize is that if this Philadelphia experiment kicked off the way it did, of course there was going to be a clandestine program. It would have been wrapped up, tied off, and a clandestine program put in place to explore this knowledge. That's what we know all governments do around the world. You know, they're not going to admit to this research, whether that's in the public domain or not. But why the location for the Montauk project on Long Island? Why was that chosen there?
Well, as with everything when you get into the super secrets sector, it has there's a multiplicity of purposes and functions. And the initial reason to go out to Montauk was that it had this huge radar transmitter that produced 435 or thereabouts megahertz, which Preston Nichols will tell you is the window frequency to the human consciousness. And therefore, they wanted this transmitter to function at the human consciousness, level of human consciousness, so that it could affect people's minds. So it is verifiable and has been demonstrated on video, including that animals and even people will react to the amplification of radio frequency at that wavelength, or a harmonic of that wavelength, which is included with the cell phones. I think cell phones are twice that. But basically, we've seen animals going crazy around Montauk, and of course there were many stories during the project of, deer running into a phone booth, deer crashing into a cafe where they used to have a picture of it on the cafe. It was actually illustrated with by an artist. So there was a lot of crazy behavior that took place with animals and people in that area.
Yeah, I think the mobile phone network range works between 600 and 900 megahertz, which is why they have these what they call them cell phones, because the cell, it's like an array over the geographic maps. They change the frequency every cell, but they have a band of frequency 600 to 900 megahertz. But basically that is a microwave frequency, which is basically cooking your brain and doing all sorts to you.
Yes, and Brookhaven Labs was where microwave research was taking place. That was sort of spawned so much, if not all, of the microwave research that occurred, at least in the United States.
Peter, I have a question for you. I know this is a little bit maybe not what we're talking about at the moment, but Brookhaven Labs, I've heard some rumors that they were responsible for creating Lyme disease and that the tick phenomena came out of Brookhaven Labs. Do you know have you heard anything about that? Do you know anything about that?
To the best of my knowledge, that's not quite correct.
Okay.
It would most likely, and is believed to, according to Preston Nichols, and he's not the only one, originated at Plum Island. Plum Island is a beautiful, gorgeous island, which I've had the unique experience of actually being on it, courtesy of the Rotary Club. They were taking us out there to show us that there was nothing going on there, even though there's like $365 million a year budget, which they admitted. And certain areas of the island you can't go on to, including the director of the island saying, I wasn't allowed to go anywhere by myself until being after here for a year. And he says, of course, that's until you have top secret security. I mean, excuse me, and he kind of like had to cover his mouth on the top security. But Plum Island, now Lyme disease was actually originally called, and you can find this on the internet, Montauk knee. And it was called Montauk knee because people's knees would swell up in sort of a inflamed arthritis. Now, Lyme disease is, of course, morphed into all sorts of different types of maladies. And I do know of a woman, the only person I've ever met that's been cured outright of Lyme disease, and she did not do this through the medical profession. She did it through the practice of Qigong. She's one of my fellow Qigong students. She was on her deathbed. And this was through breathing, just ordinary, not ordinary, but unique Qigong breathing. She actually recovered to a full state of health. That's the positive bit of news. But that answers your question. Plum Island, and then it was called Montauk knee because people at there's a lot of deer. And even there's more super secret stuff in back of this because Preston Nichols researched this when he got Lyme disease. And basically, what it was is they were trying to put a biological weapon into something that could survive an atom bomb. So when they dropped an atom bomb on Japan, there's a lot of deer in Japan, including in the Emperor's Garden. So they put a deer tick. They found out a deer tick could survive an atom bomb. And they would put the syphilis, basically the spirochete virus, which is essentially syphilis, into the deer tick so that it would the bomb would not only happen, it would infect the population. So this is, and then of course it showed up at Montauk because it's just across the ocean a short distance. And the name Montauk knee was changed to Lyme disease, in part, I think, to distract people from looking into Montauk, where they did other biological experiments.
Wow. The Montauk monster, do you want to mention that? That was the last one, I think, to hit the headlines. Do you see any validity in that?
Well, there's been at least three. I think a fourth one has come up lately. There was this weird animal that showed up on the coast of Long Island, and it was mysteriously skirted away because I knew a woman whose friend had it show up on her, beach or backyard or something like this, or the backyard of the beach. I don't remember the exact story, but basically, and then she became very funny about it. People would respond. When I went to Plum Island, that's all the people, he said that people in the press wanted to ask him about the Montauk monster. And they had this really funny theory about it, which they said it was a dog, it was this, it was somebody called it a raccoon. And they had all of these funny descriptions or excuses for what it was. And it just didn't add up. And there were other similar beasts that showed up. One on the north shore of Long Island. I think they were both and one in Canada. And of course, in both cases, they were skirted away. I reported them on my newsletter. I have a quarterly newsletter for those who are interested at my other website, skybooksusa.com. So I've written on these things in the past, but I think it's just strange phenomena. I don't think it's an ordinary carcass.
Wow.
Although it makes sense if they're doing these experiments, these biological experiments, it would make sense that you might get one loose and have it wash up someplace. I mean, doesn't that make sense logically? that eventually something's
The
going to
shaman
leak.
of the Montauk Indians told me when I told her about it, she says, you know, these things are not new to us. They've always existed. And so they don't flinch at them. They just say, okay, they're from another realm, you know, like your Loch Ness monster sort of phenomena, this type of thing. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it certainly coincides with the weird things they do at Plum Island, the secret things they do there. Yes.
So they're still operating and they're still experimenting. Do you have any updates on what they might be working on today?
Oh, you know, so much of what they put their attention on is the modification of the weather, which was from day one, which has morphed into the HARP project. Now, if you listen to Revolution Radio, Douglas Dietrich, he's one of the most interesting characters to come along the pike in the conspiracy realm, because he's talked about the HARP project being used to bind demons. This is one of its purposes. It has multiple purposes. The original purpose, he said, at least as far as the Alaskan end of it, was to reverse the Japanese current, which the Japanese current they could send balloons over in a very short amount of time to come and do warfare on the United States via balloon. This was done in the 40s. And so they was originally to reverse the current, because you can't go to America so quick to Japan from America. You can go to Japan to America very quick. But the Japanese were smart enough, because was it Hirohito, the emperor, was a marine biologist. He was a PhD. And they would come down all the way down to Peru and back to Japan. But the Americans hadn't figured out this current. They didn't know this at the time. So that was the initial one. But then it gets into a part of where they're also trying to bind demons in addition to other fun and games they do with it.
So how would that work exactly? Can you explain that a little bit more, especially
Well, I
for
wish
people?
I could explain it better. But basically, electronics control spirits. This is what I learned in Dianetics and Scientology, was the whole underlying thesis of so much of what L. Ron Hubbard had to offer his patrons was that spiritual beings could be controlled electromagnetically. And this is, of course, what we now know as psychotronics, introduced into the world by Ingo Swann, a former Scientologist and remote viewer, and who I didn't really know, but I certainly knew him, and he used to kind of spy on me. But this was so electromagnetics and spirits. In other words, a spirit can be trapped electromagnetically. So when we're dealing with all of these radio frequencies, and of course Preston Nichols would have told you the same thing. Everything I learned from Preston Nichols was sort of an outgrowth of what I learned in Dianetics and Scientology with regard to electromagnetic interfacing with human beings. So when you have the HARP project, you have an extreme, I guess what you call evolved technology of manipulating weather. And manipulating the weather is the moods. You can just watch people's moods change with the weather. So when you tie all of these things together, this is very sophisticated research that is very, I guess what you call experimented on and esoteric. So, but the idea of binding a spirit, and whether they're doing, he learned this at Sonoma State University. Sonoma State University in California, where he was actually sent to sort of spy on what the
Technology is calling.
The journalist, yes, and it's unfortunate, but the best thing is to just let it ring.
The spirits are calling, Peter.
To let it ring, and it'll go on the answering machine, because if I hang it up, they'll call back. So anyway, I mean, I can't go into the detail.
I want to stop you there. I want to stop you there for 1 second. I have to ask you this question before you move on. If that is true, and that is indeed what is happening, do you see the advancements of supercomputer technology, conscious computer technology, all of the things that are happening in the world today as part of that evolution from that?
Well, it would make sense, at least 50% at least. Yes, because the computers were very much a part of the early Montauk research and interfacing computers with the mind of man and with the radio technology. So yes, it would make sense that computers are connected to it. The entire behemoth we know as the internet. And then some of the other books that I've published and collaborators that I've dealt with have dealt with the highest level of computing, which sort of went beyond where at least anybody was publicly acknowledging the knowledge had went to. And this ties into the work of John Dee, which I know, Hillary, you're familiar with, and the meta machine is mentioned and discussed in the book, my book, Synchronicity and the Seventh Seal. The collaborator being referred to was Joseph Matheny. He created a meta machine which was sort of outdid any of the existing computers as far as human knowledge knows. I mean, there might be stuff that's more sophisticated in the secret sector.
Okay, so this naturally leads into your work with David Lewis Anderson, I think. Right. For those listening that aren't familiar with David's work, could you just offer a brief synopsis of who he is and how you know him and what you've been doing with him?
Okay, David Anderson first subscribed to my newsletter, the Montauk Pulse. That's how I knew of his existence. Then he walked into one of the monthly meetings we used to have on Long Island we called Montauk Night. He appeared there, and that's where I actually met him in person on the night of the big eclipse of August 11th, 1999. And he said he would like to work with me. And we slowly began to collaborate. He had just returned from Romania. He wanted me to go to Romania, but it took like 9 years to get me there, to actually where I arrived in Romania. In the meantime, I had a Romanian publisher who offered me a book on Romania to publish, not on Romania, but about secret computer technology, holographic computer technology that was in the mountains buried beneath the ground of Romania, where there's a Romanian Sphinx. And of course, David brought me over there in 2008, where I began to interface with Romanians, and I've been going to Romania once a year since then and investigating and researching. And of course, David, I kind of was telling what he was doing in my life. Well, I didn't really mention he was a time travel scientist. Excuse me. He was a time travel scientist who had a laboratory on Long Island where he could make time slow down and speed up the size of a soccer ball. And then by the time, a few years later, it was the size of a basketball. Now, Hillary, I know you interviewed him about 2010 or thereabouts, and by that time, he was sending humans into, he was big enough to take a human on. So humans could be subject to experiments in time. And he's a very interesting character, a very mysterious character. The last time I saw him in person was in 2010, sometime around when you did your interview, as he did a few interviews. And he showed us a video of his time reactor, an early version, where it showed a plant that would normally take 4 days to grow. It would do that growth in 3 minutes. So we saw that. There was 20 of us who saw that, or thereabouts 20, and it was a very fascinating thing. So I interviewed him this June. He had not appeared in my life except very sporadically through my association with the World Genesis Foundation, which he founded, and I'm now one of the board members. And he would sometimes appear, but he would only talk like very matter-of-factly, nothing of interest regards to time. And of course, he called me in January and eventually agreed to do a podcast, which is on the website, digitalmontauk.com, podcast number 8. We talked for over 3 hours about the latest developments. The most interesting things I got out of him in that particular interview were, one, that he has now patented proprietary technology that can cause one to go into this boundary layer, go through the boundary layers of time, a time bubble. I call it a bubble for lack of a better word. If you have an area that's slowing down time or speeding it up, and you go from that area to outside of it, you're going to get scorched like they did in the Philadelphia experiment. It has to do with radiation that appears, and it has to do with the Doppler effect, where you've got one frequency and a different frequency. So now he has a technology which enables you to actually literally walk through that time barrier. I asked him if it was like a skin diver suit. He said no. I don't know if it's a device or if it's an actual something you wear. Don't really know, but he couldn't really discuss it. I got that out of him. And I also got that, because I go to Romania, I got out of him that there was a huge discharge of what's called space-time motive force. This is when you have two bodies that are basically moving at a different time rate, such as the Earth and the Moon. You could have, if they're moving at a different time rate, which they're not, there will be a discharge of space-time motive force. And he's explained this on some videos, which are linked. If you go to my website, you will find them, where he explains how you can harvest cheap energy for the Earth, from the space-time displacement of the Earth. So basically, what he said, there was a huge discharge of space-time motive force either 200 or 2,000 years ago in this cave in Romania known as Chaklovina Cave, which was noteworthy because I had been there the previous summer. Mm-hmm. And this was, wow, he was really surprised that I'd been in that cave because I've written books about Romania and whatnot, and it's right in the area where the books that I've published have told of these very strange stories with time phenomena.
Well, wasn't he working within the private sector for up until about 2010, and then he went to work for a government agency, or is that not correct?
Well, I don't, it's probably somewhat correct. He was working for Bosch Industries in Rochester. But he was working for Bosch. He was developing biosensor technology for the security industry, and it was very high level. And then he went back in 2000, I think it was 9, he created Anderson Multinational. And Anderson Multinational was the parent company for different companies, one of which was the Anderson Institute. And you can look up andersoninstitute.com, where it's all about time travel, and this is his time travel research. But that's not the government per se, mm-hmm. But when you're in that business, the government will come to you and tell you what you can and can't do. Now, there's a patent he has on a time reactor, and I had that once on my website. It disappeared. I don't know how. And then, so I countered that by putting it into my most recent book, The White Bat, which was published last year. And chapter 7 has a whole copy of the time reactor. And the time reactor the patent was registered. It's got the registration number and everything, but it was sequestered by the U.S. government, which means that you have to have special access to see it if you're in the government, or you can look at the book. Or if I put certain things on my website and they get taken off, so it's frustrating to keep putting them back on. So I put it in
so people, if people want to know more, they can order a copy of The White Bat, and they would be able to. Okay.
Yeah, the only unfortunate thing about my books, I write through about David Anderson through more or less 4 or 5 books, the Transylvania series. I haven't had time to consolidate it all into one book on him, which I would hope to do at some indeterminate point in the future.
Now, if you do some research into the time travel research and technology realms, you'll find that it's common to be told that data is the one thing that they can literally send back and forth into time. And that's pretty accepted. My question for you is, if that's the case and data is what goes back and forth between time, and computers are evolving at an exponential rate, are we looking at potentially receiving information from the future in order to upgrade our systems in order to head into a certain direction that the future wants us to head into?
Well, this is very interesting because the future and the past and the present are all connected. They're all connected. They always were. The question is, we're stuck, and we're unsticking as a culture. We're still stuck, but we're unsticking.
Stuck in what way? What do you mean by stuck?
Well, I mean, just like in a human state, you're stuck in a body. You're kind of trapped in a body. So as a culture, we were very stuck in certain ideas. And now the culture is such that we're open to the idea of time travel. We're not very intelligent about it. We're not very experienced about it as a culture. There are isolated cases of individuals, and some people would say, oh, it goes on all the time. It's happening all the time. Well, these people may be accurate from their own perspective, but it's not culturally accurate, and they can't integrate their experiences into the culture. And this is where the only reason, I think that I have to offer in this field is that I try to integrate the nuts and bolts of it from whatever limited access I have to characters like David Anderson. So I'm very interested in the science and the grounding of it. But yes, and then when I was talking about this metamachine computer, this is basically generating synchronicity. And synchronicity means time together, or it's just the synthesis of time. So yes, the computer is going to be connected through its crystal property structure, even when the people programming the computer don't necessarily know this. Now, there's a very interesting radio host out in San Francisco, Alex Studer, and he has interviewed me a few times, but when I've talked to him privately, he's talked about this computer out in Utah. I don't know if you know anything about this huge computer out in Utah. Hillary, you familiar with this?
I know there's a NSA holding facility in Utah. Is that what you're talking about? Probably the same thing.
Well, I would imagine, I think it's underneath Granite Mountain, I think they call it. And it's basically a huge database. I mean, we talk about terabytes, and I forget what goes above a terabyte, but we're talking in those type of bytes. And because it's supposedly got data on everybody. And now, the interesting part about this book that I published, The Mystery of Egypt, by author Radu Sinamar, talks about them going and retrieving archives underneath the Giza Plateau through the tunnels in Romania. They access the Giza Plateau through these superdimensional tunnels, and they they retrieve all these archives. They're sort of like a CD or a slate, maybe like a tracking pad on but they'd be bigger than this and thicker. And see that, a tracking pad on the iMac. But anyway, it would be bigger, and then it would read out a holographic scape of time, like for, I don't know, it was thousands of years or hundreds of years. And they had all these, and they were storing them and bringing back to Washington, D.C., to the Pentagon. And I'm thinking, like, what are they going to do with these things? And I first envisioned people like, taking whatever you have on staff and then taking people from the FBI and the CIA and saying, okay, look at this disk and take notes on it. Because you got to have people to, well, then I realized this is a little ridiculous. It's not going to work. And I eventually realized that if they had this data on disk, they would take it to a place like this place in Utah, where they're going to figure out a way to download it and put it on a computer. They've become literal time archives. The concept of time archives first occurred in my research when Preston Nichols told me about Alsace-Lorraine mountains in France. There were time archives there, but as there are in Romania and in different other places. But then I realized if the government is taking all of these time archives and putting them there, it's like a Trojan horse from the people who originally put these things in from Romania, these ancient civilization. So yes, you have an interaction of the two past and the time, and how it all plays out, as I say, is where we're sitting here in this stuck zone.
Are we reverse engineering these time plates? Is that something that you think we're doing? Are we reverse engineering the technology that they have found in these mountains?
That's I never really think of them reverse engineering, because I think they're kind of the technology's so far ahead that there's an interface between the two. I don't know if reverse engineering, I mean, it may not be wrong, but it's just sort of, there's this bouncing back and forth, and this bouncing back and forth between the two, so for ancient culture and current secret government culture, is sort of a dance that's happening, and we're the ones that aren't in on it because we're walking around as citizens, and citizens are generally the last one to find out what's going on, and then how do they integrate citizens, and then where do citizens fit in as a feeding source for some form of demonic energy. This is part of the theme of Douglas Dietrich's work that he exposes, having to do with feeding demons. Part of this good and dark agenda is harvesting energy and whatnot. I think you've
if that's true, and then we have that happening, and we have a lot of people who have researched conspiracy theories and gone into some of the genres and the industry itself and looked at different aspects of it. Satanism is a real big heavy thread that runs through that, and it's been said that a lot of the high level people are practitioners of that religion. And so, do you see it as kind of like a high level elite way of feeding those demons, or what's the agenda with that demonology aspect? I keep going back to that because I'm a little bit curious about that, how that is working. I mean, what's the agenda? What's the main goal? Is it because some people are trying to capture them for their own agendas? Are they trying to prove that they exist? Are they trying to manipulate them or honor them? I mean, where do you see it going?
Well, Satanism, I mean, if you take it, it sort of derives from the concept of Satan, which means adversary. And the ultimate adversary is yourself. So you have to work out your own trip. You have to work out your own thing. What your personal adversary is. And one of the biggest mistakes people can make is fighting things external to themselves. Mm-hmm. Fighting things that external that really they best be looking to their own issue. So Satanism is a big distraction. At the same time, it's a factor that one has to notice and deal with, and not necessarily avoid, but is that the game that one wants to play? When we talk about the high level of, there's a satanic chaplain in the U.S. Army. Dietrich used to be a liaison for him in the Defense Department because that was his job, and he was, this guy wrote a satanic chaplain's handbook for the Army, because there's a lot of Satanists in the Army, and you can't deal with them if you're the chaplain as a Christian, or as if they're a Jew or some other religion. So this is a factor in the military. So what do they have their fingers in things? Yes. Do they have their fingers in everything? Not really. They don't have control. If they had control, it would be a blazing hell on earth instead of just a sort of a purgatory. So it has its place, and then there's all this. It's sort of part of the archetype that's built into the drama of the human situation. You have a negative, the evil, the dark, and the light, and this goes back to yin and yang.
Wow.
Yeah, I think we could do a whole nother show, James, on this. I think we really could.
I think it's all fascinating.
There's so many different ways that we could address that, and maybe we should. But the computer technology and the time travel technology and the realities of that are going to. Do you see that in the future, the soon future, the near future, happening where everybody accepts it as normal?
Well, I think it's already sort of here. I mean, the computer technology is here. It will continue to interface and crossbreed with more of the phenomena that's a part of the universe. But it's very interesting I feel prompted to mention this. In my second book, Montauk Revisited, which talks all about the occult correspondences with the Montauk Project that lead me into a letter correspondence with Amato Crowley, the bastard son of Aleister Crowley. This stirred up a lot of energy with magical people that work in the secret realms. And see, Amato, I had a friendly correspondence with him, and he wrote some incredibly interesting books about his father, but he was a little problematic, I would find. And anyway, what happened is, this is very interesting. I had, they wanted to import his books into the United States, and they asked me that I would import them and sell them. I was very happy to do this. But then I was called by I guess the person who was paying for the publishing costs, and his name was Steve Anthony. And I said, well, the only thing I wanted, I think I wrote to him after we talked about the prospect, I wanted to have my base covered at customs, because at customs at the JFK airport in New York, they do all sorts of outrageous and egregious things at times. So if you agree on a price, and they say, well, you're going to have to pay $200 for this box of books, it doesn't make them sellable. So being very diligent about this, I was, asking my P's and Q's, and I couldn't get my P's and Q's answered. So I didn't act on it. Had I acted on it, I would have been able to sell the books. But when you're dealing with an occult energy like this book, it can set off a lot of flames. So anyway, I kept trying to get hold of Steve Anthony because he never answered my question. When I asked about the P's and the Q's, like there's an old saying that it's okay to drink with the devil as long as you make him pay for the drinks. And I was not going to pay for the drinks here. And anyway, I didn't recognize Steve Anthony as the devil, but he was doing the son of the devil's work, so to speak, by doing this book. So I tried, and I finally had this British guy who went over and knocked on the door of Elan Computing, which is where he worked. And he was like, he couldn't get through it. He was like, he had to knock. He was having to get this occult force. And he finally told him what he was there for. What do you want to know for? What do you want to know for? And this sort of British bullshit, when they'll say, what do you know to know for? And he says, well, and he just, and then I had somebody who traced down Diamond Books, which was the name of the book company. And he did the same thing. He says, I want to find out where your books. He finally comes to this street vendor. What do you want to know for? He says, I want to buy a book. Why? This sort of stuff. And it was just impossible. And then eventually I would find out that Elan Computing, with the Steve Anthony guy, owned one of the biggest computer companies in the UK. It was one of the most connected. There was that movie, and I didn't watch the whole movie. I know part of it, Damien. They had the 666 guy. It was as if that was his company. Now, I have nothing bad to say about Steve Anthony because I don't know him. I just had one conversation with him. But he was apparently, so connected that I don't even think David Icke knows about him. I don't really know if David Icke has written about him or not because I don't follow David Icke. But you know what I'm saying? It's like, wow.
But David's done a lot of really positive, good research. He's a good researcher into that stuff.
That's not my point. My point is that this guy is so, into the hub of things and the importance things when you talk about computing that I don't think, in other words, he's remained occulted. That's what I'm saying. Because David tries to find occult stuff, and I'm saying this guy is more occult than unless I'm mistaken, because I haven't followed his work to know. That's my point.
Yeah. So what happened out of that? You ended up not doing anything, not engaging. And did you feel that was part of your own protection of sorts to not get involved with that?
Well, perhaps. But I think the other point here is that this level of computing was it was bridged to this dark occult energy. What I found out about Otto, he's dead now, is that we had this, he just went out of communication with me very weirdly. And he says, I'm so relieved to be in communication with you again. And then I never heard another thing from him. And I found out there was a very dark side reported to me about him. It was so dark that, people on the outskirts wouldn't necessarily learn about it. So I don't even know if the dark side is true, except that somebody did get in touch. And it's Peter Moon wants to get in touch with you. What does he want to get in touch with me for? What is he writing about me now? And he's not writing anything about you. He just would like to get in touch with you because he wrote to you and he didn't hear back. And sometimes people just don't write. So it's this sort of British attitude that is just endemic to the British condition, not with every Brit, but certainly with a percentage of them that represent the power elite, or those who fend off the power elite, not even knowingly. So this is, yes, it's best off that I'm not involved with that.
Yeah, I would think so. Which leads me to my next question, to talk about Aleister Crowley, who was paid to write the Book of Shadows, which started the Garnerian witchcraft. Now, do you see anything connected into that realm with what we've been discussing so far this hour?
Well, I think the witchcraft is a lot of it that gets talked about in the public is a big distraction. And a lot of the groups are a distractive group because, in the Gardnerian witchcraft, you have, this is sort of, it is this, what was his name, Lawrence Gardner? And it's sort of like it's a man. Well, witchcraft is a female thing. So, what is, the head witch, you want to go back into the matriarchal traditions of Wicca, and so it gets distorted. And there's a whole history of witches being burned, and we hear about the Jews and being executed, the Inquisition taking people, but we don't hear about the Holocaust of the females. And this is a big sore point with Gaia. So yeah, there's a connection, and the Aleister Crowley did a ritual in 1943, which Amato told me was on the day of the Philadelphia experiment, August 12th, and it was done at Menatol, where they have this donut-shaped stone.
Cornwall, yeah.
Cornwall, yes, and there is a direct line, there's a direct cable that goes from there to Montauk directly.
Wow.
And so, anyway, there was a bunch of energy stirred up at that point, Hillary, when you and I went out to Montauk together. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of points stirred up on that energy. And then I learned out that this guy, James Casebolt, that I told you about that you weren't aware of, and I just learned from my friend in Cornwall that he was doing all sorts of rituals around there. And he's ended up in jail for, I don't know why, the real reason he's in jail, supposedly for putting up indecent photos of his wife on the internet, his ex-wife.
It's incredible you say that, because I have lived in Penzance, Peter, and there's cables going from Cornwall to every continent in the world. I do know that there's even a little museum there for this since like telegraph times. But yeah, they do. I know there's ones going to New York. I wasn't aware it was going to Montauk though.
There is one that goes to Montauk,
wow.
And but see, Cornwall is a big center point. It's one of the most important grid points, and it's just, I've never had time to take it apart and just do a whole dedicated thing to Cornwall. There's a lot of murders that occurred there that all were in the wake of Aleister Crowley's presence there. There was a book written on it. I forget the name of the book, but the author was Paul Newman, which caused me to look into the actor Paul Newman, which led me to discover that he was the owner of the biggest S&M club in Hollywood, L.A., the actor Paul Newman, and there was a whole secret side to his life you never hear about, because he had the pretty marriage to Joanne Woodward. This was all public relations, excellent public relations. He figured out the PR game. He came out of a stable of young homosexuals in the 1950s connected to Tennessee Williams. And you see him appearing in these Tennessee Williams movies. So Paul Newman, and so he's never really been known as a homosexual in the press. But I think I first learned of it when the New York Post hated him with a passion. They used to just really rip him to shreds, mostly attacking his height, not his sexuality. And they'd write whole articles about how he's really not 5 foot, 10 like he says. He's really 5'8", and then they'd have an article 2 weeks later that says he's not really 5'8", he's 5'6", and he's wearing heels. I mean, this was really funny, like a lift. They would just attack Paul Newman, and it was so bizarre. Like, why are they attacking this guy?
So why Cornwall? Why Cornwall? I have to ask both of you that question, since you both have
to to add to that, Hillary, I know there's really strange energy at Menontal. There's lots of megaliths down there. It's the megalith with this circular. It's this circular with a hole in it. But yeah, I know there's a lot of rituals that go down there. The energy when you go to some of those megalithic places in Cornwall, there's a strange energy there. I don't know whether it's good or bad. You can definitely feel it. And I don't feel energy at many megalithic places. I'm not one of these energy feeling guys, but there I did. Menontal, there's a strange energy there.
What did you feel exactly? Like, describe that.
Confusion, mixed. I don't know. I mean, I couldn't say it was bad or good. Disorientating, probably a disorientated energy. I didn't like it because I don't like disorientation. Very logical guy. I like direction.
This is the evidence of a polluted part on the grid where the feminine has been desecrated. Now there's a phallic stone and the donut stone. That's a male and female of a balance. So basically, and this character was doing this ritual around there, and it had to be incredibly male oriented and was not balanced. And I knew who the guy was, but I really knew not much about him other than that he thought he was a super soldier, and he was in the intelligence community, and I just wasn't that interested because this is like more diarrhea of information to me. But and I wouldn't say he wasn't in those projects. It's just, but it wasn't very, I guess, coming out very sanely, as most of them don't. But in any case, he's doing all this sort of imbalanced rituals. And this is not a good thing. When one goes to a sacred site, one should breathe. One should do qigong, which means breath work, put spirit into the area. Now, you could have different people that are on the up and up. Any sort of energy into that is going to be positive. But it sounds to me from what you're saying, you'd be prepared to get your socks knocked off if you go there.
Sure, yeah.
So this is, I mean, Hillary and I felt it from thousands of miles away at Montauk.
Wow.
Where else do the other cables go to? Where do they
From Cornwall?
go?
In Cornwall, they go to India, Australia. They go to all the continents. There's a telegraph museum there, and they've been laying cables there all the way around the world for telegraph times. And then when Hitler tried to invade England, he would have took one of Porthcurno Beach, which is a telegraph museum there. But to stop Hitler taking the beach, they burned the beach for 5 years. The British just put the beach on fire for 5 years and went, "You're not landing here," because the cables came up that beach there. But
And why
Cornwall,
did they choose that area? What was so
well,
significant
it's the bit of
there?
Britain. It's also not so much that as Marconi did his first broadcast from there as well. So it's a strategic point in terms of frequencies. Because it's the bit of Britain that sticks into the Atlantic, you see, that little toe that sits down there. So,
Right, and I believe Marconi did those transmissions from Montauk.
Yeah.
So there is a heritage there. There's an earlier legacy. But there is, if she would want to go on, there's somebody I could recommend you to who knows she lives right there in Cornwall, and she could give a whole diatribe.
Oh,
and one of the things that I've learned from her is that, Prince Charles is basically
the Duchy of Cornwall, yeah.
Yeah, he funds. Yeah, it's his. Yeah, but he funds his whole private money from there, and there's a whole bunch of misappropriations that he's guilty of, and that Cornwall is funding so much of what goes on in his world.
Wow.
So, and of course, Prince Charles is also slated, according to the Romanian press, is slated to be the next king of Romania. When King Michael is about 94 years old, and when he dies, because he has all this property in Transylvania, and there's constant rumors that he will abdicate the throne if Queen Elizabeth dies, give it to his son, and then he will go be the king of Romania because of all of its esoteric. They don't say because of its esoteric, but this is something that would be very interesting to see if it happens.
Wow, it's incredible. Back on the Romanian, just to wrap up, Peter, I wanted to ask you, do we know the antiquity of this place, the Hall of Records, or the Romanian Sphinx? Do we know a date, roughly, an approximate?
They say the Sphinx was put up 50,000 years ago, and when they try to penetrate the secrets of these time travel archives underneath, which are bioresonant, they get stopped. In other words, the people who created them don't let you look, and you can't look at who built built them. You can look at everything else, but you can't look at who built them. So you're always playing in games of censorship on any level of the universe that you get into.
Mm-hmm.
And before I wrap up here, I want to thank you both. It's been a very stimulating and interesting and different interview.
Wow. Well, thank you, Peter. I really appreciate your time today.
Yeah. Good stuff. Good stuff.
You got any final comments, Hillary?
I'm thinking about so much stuff right now. It's hard to wrap it up, but I really think there's more to explore when it comes to this computer stuff. I've been really, all summer I've been musing on this computer stuff. I went to France in June, and ever since then, exploring the deep web, going into the technologies that are, that are transforming our world, really. So when you added an element to it that I wasn't aware of, and I'm going to sit with that for a little while. So my closing comments are: listen to the show again, see what you get out of it, and go run with it, and go do your own research, and listen to Peter's podcast with David Lewis Anderson on his website. It's podcast 8. It's excellent. And there's a lot of truth to the work that David is doing. And Peter, thank you for doing what you do.
Let me say 2 words: artificial intelligence, with reference to the computers, and the concept of the golem, as talked about in the Golem of Prague.
First time talking to you, Peter. I just think this whole research, from what I've seen from the outspec, I know you're going to tell us in detail, I think it's fascinating. Maybe we can talk about the collaboration with Preston, Nichols, and the backdrop of the Philadelphia experiment, and just give us a synopsis for those people that want to know about the Montauk project.
Okay, a very quick synopsis is that, and I learned so much of this from Preston Nichols, and is that the Philadelphia experiment was a experiment in 1943, which was the culmination of many years of research when the Navy was trying to make a destroyer escort appear invisible to radar because of all the Nazi ships that were sinking American ships, merchant ships. And this experimentation involved the degaussing or the demagnetizing rather, of the ship. And this was coincident with the ship disappearing and it actually moving back into time or forward into time. We don't know I don't know the exact dates it moved to. This experiments caused a great deal of trauma to the crew. Research was done primarily at Camp Upton, which is now Brookhaven National Laboratories. And I've had the unique experience of actually being on it, courtesy of the Rotary Club. They were taking us out there to show us that there was nothing going on there, even though there's like $365 million a year budget, which they admitted. And certain areas of the island you can't go on to, including the director of the island saying, I wasn't allowed to go anywhere by myself until being after here for a year. And he says, of course, that's until you have top secret security. I mean, excuse me, and he kind of like had to cover his mouth on the top security. But Plum Island, now Lyme disease was actually originally called, and you can find this on the internet, Montauk knee. And it was called Montauk knee because people's knees would swell up in sort of a inflamed arthritis. Now, Lyme disease is, of course, morphed into all sorts of different types of maladies. And I do know of a woman, the only person I've ever met that's been cured outright of Lyme disease, and she did not do this through the medical profession. She did it through the practice of Qigong. She's one of my fellow Qigong students. She was on her deathbed. And this was through breathing, just ordinary, not ordinary, but unique Qigong breathing. She actually recovered to a full state of health. That's the positive bit of news. But that answers your question. Plum Island, and then it was called Montauk Knee because people at Montauk, there's a lot of deer. And even there's more super secret stuff in back of this, because Preston Nichols researched this when he got Lyme disease. And basically what it was is they were trying to put a biological weapon into something that could survive an atom bomb. So when they dropped an atom bomb on Japan, there's a lot of deer in Japan, including in the Emperor's Garden. So they put a deer tick. They found out a deer tick could survive an atom bomb. And they would put the syphilis, basically the spirochete virus, which is, this was figuring out the mind of man and what made it tick, and how come it, when it went into time displacement, it became distorted. Humans became distorted, their bodies, their minds, their spirits. So this research carried on at Montauk eventually, at first at Brookhaven, and then it went to Montauk, where they were successfully connecting up people to the radio frequency, and they would amplify the radio frequency, and where thoughts could come out on a computer, or they could come out into the ether, so to speak. And this is what the Montauk Project was, in a nutshell, in a very brief nutshell. I mean, of course, Hillary's very familiar with it from having read the book and talked to various people, including myself.
Peter, maybe well, the thing that I realize is that if this Philadelphia experiment kicked off the way it did, of course there was going to be a clandestine program. It would have been wrapped up, tied off, and a clandestine program put in place to explore this knowledge. That's what we know all governments do around the world. You know, they're not going to admit to this research, whether that's in the public domain or not. But why the location for the Montauk project on Long Island? Why was that chosen there?
Well, as with everything in the, when you get into the super secrets sector, it has there's a multiplicity of purposes and functions. And well, the initial reason to go out to Montauk was that it had this huge radar transmitter that produced 435 or thereabouts megahertz, which Preston Nichols will tell you is the window frequency to the human consciousness. And therefore, they wanted this essentially syphilis into the deer tick, so that it would not only, the bomb would not only happen, it would infect the population. So this is, and then of course it showed up at Montauk because it's just across the ocean a short distance. And the name Montauk knee was changed to Lyme disease, in part, I think, to distract people from looking into Montauk, where they did other biological experiments.
Wow. The Montauk monster, do you want to mention that? That was the last one, I think, to hit the headlines. Do you see any validity in that? Well,
there's been at least three, I think a fourth one has come up lately. There was this weird animal that showed up on the coast of Long Island, and it was mysteriously skirted away, because I knew a woman whose friend had it show up on her, beach or backyard or something like this, or the backyard of the beach. I don't remember the exact story, but basically, and then she became very funny about it. People would respond. When I went to Plum Island, that's all the people, he said that people in the press wanted to ask him about the Montauk monster. And they had this really funny theory about it, which they said it was a dog, it was this, it was somebody called it a raccoon. And they had all of these funny descriptions or excuses for what it was. And it just didn't add up. And there were other similar beasts that showed up, one on the north shore of Long Island. I think they were both and one in Canada. And of course, in both cases, they were skirted away. I reported them on my newsletter. I have a quarterly newsletter for those who are interested at my other website, skybooksusa.com. So I've written on these things in the past, but I think it's just strange phenomena. I don't think it's an ordinary carcass.
Wow.
Well, that would make sense if they're doing these experiments, these biological experiments. It would make
transmitter to function at the human consciousness level of human consciousness, so that it could affect people's minds. So it is verifiable and has been demonstrated on video, including that animals and even people will react to the amplification of radio frequency at that wavelength, or a harmonic of that wavelength, which is included with the cell phones. I think cell phones are twice that. But basically, we've seen animals going crazy around Montauk, and of course, there were many stories during the project of, deer running into a phone booth, deer crashing into a cafe where they used to have a picture of it on the cafe. It was actually illustrated with by an artist. So there was a lot of crazy behavior that took place with animals and people in that area.
Yeah, I think the mobile phone network range works between 600 and 900 megahertz, which is why they have these what they call them cell phones, because the cell, it's like an array over the geographic maps. They change the frequency every cell, but they have a band of frequency 600 to 900 megahertz. But basically that is a microwave frequency, which is basically cooking your brain and doing all sorts to you.
Yes, and Brookhaven Labs was where microwave research was taking place. That was sort of spawned so much, if not all, of the microwave research that occurred, at least in the United States.
Peter, I have a question for you. I know this is a little bit maybe not what we're talking about at the moment, but Brookhaven Labs, I've heard some rumors that they were responsible for creating Lyme disease, and that the tick phenomena came out of Brookhaven Labs. Do you know have you heard anything about that? Do you know anything about that?
To the best of my knowledge, that's not quite correct.
Okay.
It would most likely, and is believed to, according to Preston Nichols, and he's not the only one, originated at Plum Island. Plum Island is a beautiful, gorgeous island, which